Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual dialogue this afternoon. We are thrilled to present these two scholars. But before we get started, I have a little bit of housekeeping. If you take a look at your Zoom window and you notice the chat icon and the Q&A icon, feel free to click either of those and type questions that you have for Sarah or Elizabeth throughout today's presentations. There will be a Q&A at the end of the discussion, but you are free to ask questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to fire those off. Also, if you enjoy this conversation and you want to see more programs from the Decorative Arts Trust, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can do that by Googling Decorative Arts Trust YouTube and just clicking the subscribe icon at the top of the page. We greatly appreciate all of our subscriptions, so please go ahead if you can. And also, if you are not currently a member of the Decorative Arts Trust, please consider becoming a member. We have a ton of really wonderful benefits that we offer, along with being updated on all of the programming that the Decorative Arts Trust offers. You will also receive the magazine and be updated on bulletin posts. So please check out the Decorative Arts Trust website and become a member if you are not one already. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Grandin, who just recently completed her PhD in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University. Her dissertation focuses on issues of scale in the graphic and decorative arts in the age of Louis XIV. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and comparative literature from Stanford. From 2017 to 2019, Grandin was a visiting fellow at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most selective and prestigious graduate schools in France. While pursuing her education, Sarah participated in the development of exhibitions presented at both Stanford and Harvard. She currently serves as the Clark-Getty Curatorial Fellow, and she's based at the Clark Institute of Art, where she will assist in the development of a planned 2022-23 exhibition of 18th century French drawings in collaboration with Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and we are thrilled to have her. So Sarah, without further ado, I turn the podium over to you.
All right, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Carrie. So to begin, I must extend my warmest thanks to Carrie for organizing today's dialogue and to the Decorative Arts Trust for the invitation to share my research with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Is that working? Can you see that, Carrie? Sorry, Carrie, could you confirm that my screen is being shared?
1 second, I'm not seeing it. Let me just, I'm looking at it from my end. Okay.
Oh, you know what? It's my fault. There we go. Should be visible now. Is that the case?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Anyway, so I've been thinking about Louis XIV Savonnerie carpets for almost a decade now, and they continue to fascinate me. And so I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss the subject with Lizzie, who is such an accomplished scholar of the textile arts, and to field questions from those of you who are joining us today at the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'll begin. All right, so between 1668 and 1689, two French workshops wove 93 massive carpets to fill the Louvre's Grand Gallery, which was a staggering 440 meters long. Even before he became Louis XIV's Minister of Buildings, Jean-Baptiste Colbert began hatching a plan to procure a fleet of giant carpets to fill and thus visually unite the interior. In 1662, at which time he was Minister of the Marine, Colbert asked his intendant in the port city of Toulon if he could obtain the furnishings from workshops in Cairo by way of Near Eastern trade routes. He specified his desire for carpets, I quote, of the greatest possible extent. And this was the only term he defined, the carpet's dimensions. He said nothing of motifs or color or style. Size. Size was the issue that mattered most. A decorative mandate of uninterrupted, cohesive grandeur required ginormous floor coverings. In the end, though, Colbert enlisted the expertise of two rival workshops in Paris specializing in hand-knotted pile carpets woven in the Turkish manner. The Dupont and Lordet families came together at a former soap factory on the outskirts of Paris, from which the enterprise gained its name, the Savonnerie, savon being the French word for soap. While originally housed in cramped workshops underneath the Grande Galerie, visible on the right here in the distance where I've shaded it in blue, the carpet weavers decamped to this more spacious locale, which Israel Sivestre depicts in the foreground in this print, and I've shaded the factories in red. The manufacturers took 20 years to complete their monumental task, a duration of time commensurate with the carpet's considerable volume. The carpets had a collective surface area of over 3,700 square meters, the equivalent of approximately 14 tennis courts. While the carpets were smaller than the dimensions Colbert had originally requested, each was still almost 9 meters long and 4 or 5 meters wide. One surviving carpet is pictured here in the former President François Hollande's office at the Élysée in Paris in 2017. And to give you a sense of just how large these textiles are, the Getty had to deaccession one of their carpets when constraints led them to shrink the size of their Hilltop campus by 10% on the eve of construction. And many carpets have been cut down over the years to squeeze into the drawing rooms and around the fireplaces of private mansions most of us would deem palatial, as with the specimen that belonged to Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, now held at Waddesdon Manor. Now, formally, the carpets were devised to project uniformity at an imposing scale. They boast regular proportions and an even surface facture, and they share a deep black ground overlaid with flowers and scrolling acanthus leaves that behave as if they were pressed between two planes. The whole is bound by identical gadrooned borders. Each carpet is bilaterally symmetrical on two sides, on two axes, and has a tripartite composition. Its center bursts with symbols of royal splendor, with each end capped by a cartouche. The latter alternate throughout the series between allegorical figures imitating Camus bas-reliefs, such as that you see at the bottom at left, and picturesque landscapes in warm hues, shown on the right. And in this way, the carpets shift between allusions to the sovereign's attributes and to the territory he ruled. Peace and plenty, Mars and Minerva are wedged between tree-lined scenes of meandering streams and undulating hills. This pairing evokes, I argue, the coexistence of the king's magisterial claims to power, his imperium, and his proprietary dominion, his dominium. That is, the allegories evoke the boundless, absolute, and abstract dimensions of his sovereignty, while the landscapes reference the physical territory he ruled. As records from the workshops show, however, the directors were preoccupied above all with the carpet's size. Each carpet was recorded in Dupont's inventory as a grid in red crayon that indicated at a reduced scale the carpet's length and height in the unit of the aune. The gridded system of notation resulted, no doubt, from the fact that the crown paid the workshops by the square aune. The workshops paid their artisans in turn by the dizaine, or 10 by 10 knots square, a system about which I will speak more further on. The workshop director's concern with the carpet's dimensions differed in many ways from Colbert's decorative and symbolic ambitions to make furnishings proportional to the Sun King's grandeur. For the directors, making big carpets meant they faced technical and material challenges and incurred great risk and great expense. As I will show in this presentation today, these administrative and artisanal concerns were actually deeply intertwined. The very ability to make large carpets was, in and of itself, an expression of geopolitical triumph. As we consider these lofty projections, though, I find it essential not to lose sight of the Dupont's grids, of these units of measure, and of the management of human gestures and labor they represent. Indeed, subtending the carpet's overarching visual unity was a finer grained structure of repetition, that of individual Giordis knots affixed to a matrix of warp and weft, like so many pixels of color in dyed wool. Together, the 93 carpets comprised over 5,600,000 knots, the lustrous colors and fine, dense facture of which we can see in this close-up of a gadrooned border. The Dupon's records and Colbert's initial demand for carpets of the greatest extent demonstrate the degree to which the carpet's dimensions were central to their identification and character. And yet, the collective size of the Savonnerie carpets woven for the Grande Galerie has never been the object of critical attention. By considering the carpet's reticulated surfaces, along the administration's persistent preoccupation with their measurement, the very magnitude at which these discrete knots were assembled emerges as the carpet's most audacious feature. The scale of the project was new both in its overall scope and in the dimensions of each individual carpet. Producing these carpets at this scale required, as we shall see, new methods of resource extraction and new labor structures that laid bare the royal administration's attitude toward its land and its citizens. The territorial mastery projected in the carpet's motifs was also flexed in the manufacturing processes that made them. The carpets were made to mobilize nature and labor for political effect in a figured and material display. By reading the carpet's symbolic function through the conditions of their production, it is possible to see their velour surfaces for what they are: millions of knots that record Louis XIV's exacting and exploitative relationship to his land and people. My talk today will uncover the ecological and human implications of Colbert's request for carpets unprecedented in their size and collective surface area. First, making carpets so long required exceptionally large looms, and exceptionally large looms required exceptionally tall, strong, and straight trees for the loom's rollers. Obtaining these trees was tied up in new methods of forestry management that Colbert pioneered in his quest to make France an unmatched naval competitor on the world stage. Second, making such a great volume of carpets necessitated many dexterous practitioners, which the administration found in the steady supply of young orphans whose parents had perished at the General Hospital of Paris. Towering fir trees and child labor. These were the practical solutions to problems brought about by Colbert's decorative vision and geometric ambitions. In their great extent, the Savonnerie carpets displayed the extensive network of production from which they emerged and formally registered the mobilization of bodies and goods from which they came. By looking into how the crown dealt with various natural and human limits in its quest for grandeur, one gains insight into the ways in which the Savonnerie carpets were also wrapped up in notions of royal stewardship, land management, and kingly paternalism. Armed with a specific understanding of the significance of trees in this period, and in the manufacture of these carpets, it also becomes possible for the very first time to interpret the logic of the landscape cartouches that grace the ends of half of the carpets in the series, details of which we see extracted here. Now, before I proceed, there are two premises to my argument that I wish to gloss. The first is the notion that royal furnishings were part of royal diplomacy and the tactical display of splendor. This might be something you would take for granted, but I think it merits a little bit of unpacking. Textiles such as Savonnerie carpets were sent as gifts to courts as far away as the kingdom of Siam, present-day Thailand, and they were ostentatiously unfurled when Persian ambassadors visited France. The perceived political importance of the fiber arts at the moment production began for the Grande Galerie carpets is further demonstrated by the proliferation of wall almanacs celebrating royal manufacturing, published in the year 1666. This is the year after Colbert incorporated over 20 artisanal and industrial trades under the aegis of the crown. Now, this etching engraving printed on satin depicts, according to the inscribed sheet held by the figure at bottom, I quote, "The commerce of France with the four parts of the world and with all sorts of manufactories established during the reign of our powerful monarch, Louis XIV. Those carpets that belonged to the crown were described in documents of the period as portable monuments to royal glory and as fruits of the order achieved during times of peace. Furthermore, Colbert, pictured here, saw France's position on the world stage as intertwined with the robustness of its manufacturing and its management of resources. And he viewed the domestic production of textiles and furnishings as integral to the economic well-being of the French kingdom. He stated that in such manufacturing efforts lay, I quote, the grandeur and power of the state and the magnificence of the king by way of the expenditures that such great revenues allowed him to make, end quote. Now, the degree to which Colbert viewed textiles as vital to his agenda is evident in this 1664 engraving, which I show here, in which his portrait, framed in oak leaves, is nestled against a tapestry worked upon by Minerva, the goddess of industry. Now, the second premise I must address is that the Grande Galerie was a space involved in territorial posturing. As 17th century architectural theorists wrote, galleries were spaces for walking, especially suited to elaborate painting cycles. Now, this slide is blank because we know of no surviving images that depict the gallery as it was under Louis XIV in any meaningful or accurate detail. Indeed, though, the Grand Gallery was exceptionally long, so much so that as a child, Louis XIV's father, used it on rainy days as a route for dog-drawn carriage rides and as a runway on which to let sparrows loose, to set hounds on foxes, and to observe a camel accelerate to a gallop. Standing at one end of the carpeted Grand Galerie then, the viewer was to be impressed by the carpet's coherence and dimensions, their scale projecting the order and grandeur of the king's dominion. Originally, topographic paintings of provincial municipalities by Jacques Fouquier were to be installed in the bays between the windows to conjure an image of the kingdom's emerging territorial unity, so that to walk its lengths was to virtually toe the far reaches of France. The gallery also eventually became the home to the royal plein relief. And these are large-scale models of the fortified towns that shored up France's borders, illustrated in situ here. Within this context, the carpets embody the crown's territorial ambitions through their audacious occupation of decorative ground. Just as Louis XIV sought to unify the patchwork of royal, private, seigneurial, and ecclesiastic lands he inherited, and to expand French borders to the east, the Savonnerie carpets were designed to unify the gallery. The carpet's ambitious dimensions echo those of the state on a smaller, if still palatial scale. In the time that remains, I will begin with a discussion of the trees involved in the carpet's manufacture, and then I will turn to the other forgotten figures of the project, the children conscripted to help make the carpets. Recovering these figures will show the ways in which human and arboreal subjects were abstracted and depersonalized in pursuit of the crown's scalar ambitions, despite the resistance these individuals mounted along the way. Now, quite concretely, the dimensions of the Savonnerie carpets were restricted by the proportions of the looms on which they were woven. A technical analysis of several Grande Galerie carpets and their knot orientation by Getty curator Carissa Bremer-David shows that they were mounted lengthwise while woven, from which we can infer that the looms and the fir trees used to build them were over 30 feet long. This diagram conveys the orientation of carpets Colbert initially envisioned in comparison to that ultimately delivered at bottom. The length of trees and in turn loom construction were limiting factors in the dimensions of these carpets. In October 1665, another of Colbert's provincial intendants, Monsieur Courtin, reported that he had finally found 12 firs suitable for the warp beams of Savonnerie looms, which he would send to Paris via an Auvergnat wood merchant. The exchange between Courtin and Colbert was part of a larger overhaul of forestry oversight and lumber sourcing in France in the 1660s. At the time of his correspondence, the intendant was examining royal forests to identify trees large enough to construct the masts of naval vessels. Colbert's zeal for forestry management was motivated by his quest to build a competitive naval fleet for France. He wrote in 1661, I quote, "The power of the king is superior on land to that of all others in Europe. On the sea, his is inferior, and that power must be made uniform everywhere." Colbert's marine revival was commemorated in medals and in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, as shown in this painting by Lebrun, celebrating the reestablishment of the Royal Marine under Colbert. And you can note the tall masts floating sort of conspicuously in the background, like a felled and resurrected forest put out to sea. Under Colbert's watch, the administration began to source trees with new urgency and precision. This was because, as naval historian Fred T. Jane wrote, the limitations of the tree proved the limitations of the ship. Louis XIV's carpets and ships shared tall timber as one of their crucial raw materials. The fabrication of ships and looms required overlapping areas of expertise, a fact that is perhaps best illustrated by the career and writings of Henri-Louis Duhamel du Monceau, who was active in the middle of the 18th century. An intendant of the Marine and member of the Academy of Sciences, Duhamel du Monceau wrote treatises and encyclopedia entries on shipbuilding, timber, trees, and rope manufacturing. In 1766, he also authored The Art of Making Carpets in the Turkish Manner, known by the name Savonnerie, as part of the Description of Arts and Trades publication series. So he was really a man of many interests, many of which revolved around timber. Duhamel du Monceau applied expertise gleaned in shipyards and in forests to his description of loom construction, noting that when green wood was used to make the beams, they would bend under the immense pressure created by thousands of taut linen warp threads, thus creating unwanted slackness at the carpet's center. To remedy this, he recommended arming the beam with iron bands and also seasoning the wood beforehand, leaving it exposed to the summer sun and the harsh winter climate while turning it regularly. Both ship masts and looms depended on the strength, suppleness, and lightness unique to resinous conifers. The materials necessary to make Louis XIV's carpets and armadas were sourced in the same stretch of woods by the same royal surveyor, a concomitance that shows how the spectacle of power, whether decorative or military, relied upon the harnessing of tools suited for the job. Under Colbert's new system of forestry management, woods were organized, desirable trees protected, and rivers mapped. Surveying forests made the state a visible and effective steward of territorial France, and forestry reform itself was ultimately a tool of provincial surveillance. Such methods established a precedent for what political scientist James Scott has termed fiscal forestry in the context of late 18th century Prussian practices. Casting aside the diverse possible uses of trees and the flora and fauna that surrounded them, this new approach reduced the forest to board feet and cords of firewood. Scott wrote, and I quote him now, that forest science and geometry backed by state power had the capacity to transform the real, diverse, and chaotic old-growth forest into a new, more uniform forest that closely resembled the administrative grid of its techniques, end quote. Land was made to reflect the regular cells, rows, and columns of its record keepers. Methods of forest management had not yet reached this degree of geometric rigor under Louis XIV, although attempts to measure and record the contents of royal forests were underway. In his notes from the end of the 17th century, the technician Père Sébastien Trouchet proposed a method for, I quote, counting and marking trees according to their diameter, quality, and defects. Straight lines were used to indicate perfect trees, forked lines for forked trees, curved lines for curved trees, to which dots were added to mark the number of flaws detected. Unlike masts, which required straight timber, ship hulls demanded large and often crooked timbers. This curved or compass timber tended to come from isolated trees, which displayed more distinctiveness in shape than those found in dense forests or planted groves. The varied shapes of trees were valued only insofar as they served some utilitarian end, though. Attention to the trees' varied forms can also be observed in the landscape cartouches for the Grande Galerie carpets. Unlike the serene scenes of nature they bracket, these trees announce their propensity for non-compliance. Split, curved, or gnarled, they frame a compressed terrain that moves swiftly from sun-kissed foreground to blue yonder with minimal staffage along the way. Trees thus serve a physical frame on which the carpet was woven, and as repoussoir, a framing convention of landscape painting. They frame idyllic nature within the woven picture plane. Both kinds of trees, prized in shipbuilding, thus figure in the Savonnerie carpets. The straight fir of masts undergirds the carpet's rectangular extent, and the curved body of deciduous specimens animates the landscape images. The value conferred by the carpet's incredibly long, straight edges, which are themselves indices of long, straight trees, is captured in a royal device invented by Louis XIV's Academy of Inscriptions and Letters. This Petite Académie, as it was called, generated emblems in the 1660s for the borders of Gobelin tapestries representing the elements and seasons. So this project was taking place at the same time as the invention of designs for the Savonnerie carpets. Within the section devoted to the element of earth, terre, one device centers on a towering fir tree and has the motto rectus se tollit in altum. It rises straight to the heights. The tree was chosen to evoke the king's moral uprightness, his ambition, and his unswerving will, the very qualities that made fir trees essential to the manufacture of grand vessels and giant carpets were also seized upon in simile to glorify the king. What to make then of the more rustic, charmingly irregular and picturesque trees of the carpet landscapes? I would argue that the peculiar forms of the woven trees also serve a sort of utilitarian purpose, a decorative one, that of visual variety. Given its low status in the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, there is little theorization of landscape painting in France in the 17th century. In his 1708 treatise, Cours de peinture par principe on painting, Roger de Pile devoted a section to the painting of trees, remarking that in addition to differing among species, trees were varied among their kind. It was, he remarked, I quote, as if Hazard had taken the pleasure of following nature in its diverse bizarreness, end quote. De Pile encouraged trees' variety to be represented in painted landscape because, he said, the repetition of the same strokes within the same landscape causes a sort of boredom for the eyes, like the monotony of a speech causes in the ears. Trees, he remarked, were landscape's greatest ornament. As I have proposed elsewhere, the trees of the Savonnerie carpets resemble those painted by a certain François Bellin, who collaborated with the carpet's likely designer and Louis XIV's first painter, Charles Lebrun, and he did so at Vaux-le-Vicomte and at the Louvre. Prior to that, Bellin assisted Simon Vouet with panels for Anne d'Autriche, Louis XIV's mother, for which Bellin rendered the trees of the central cartouche, which share the Savonnerie carpet's disposition and measured level of descriptive detail. And you can see our only surviving record of this wall panel collaboration in the print at left. Bellin's trees, such as that shown in the painting at right, offer a pleasing variety, but not with a degree of difference that might incite distraction. They do not compete for the attention of the whole decorative program of which they are a part. These trees have not the pathos of Romanticism's arboreal protagonists. Though the Savonnerie trees gesture towards individualism, the very material resolution of the carpets also precludes the level of detail that might qualify them as tree portraits. They offer a mere visual shorthand of variety and specificity. Moreover, the carpet landscapes are an alias of the original compositions, not unlike a digital image comprised of distinct pixels arrayed in a grid. Indeed, cartoons for the Savonnerie carpets were often painted on specially printed graph paper, a technique referenced in Duhamel du Monceau's 766 treatise. Each actual size motif of the paper design, called a patron, was then translated, rendered in discrete knots of wool, which were affixed by individual human hands moving along a grid, and the transposition of fluid paint strokes into tactile tufts. The weaver would have composed his landscapes from a palette of wool threads in different colors, sometimes twisting two hues together to create greater tonal nuance. And here is an incredible set of dyed wool color samples from the late 18th century, used by the Savonnerie workshops, and these are stored in the Archives Nationales outside of Paris. Now, is this visible in the bent grasses in the bottom of this Metropolitan-owned standalone Savonnerie landscape panel? Curved and diagonal lines were inevitably rendered as jagged staircases when rendered in knots in the grid of warp and weft. This sawtooth appearance results from a disparity in resolution, the difference between the density of paint particles suspended in oil and the immutable reticulated matrix of warp and weft. Due to their very makeup, the Savonnerie landscape cartouches ultimately offer limited visual information about the trees they represent. On the one hand, they evoke trees' special status in the state's territorial network of natural resource management. This particularity stands in contrast to the depersonalization the carpet structure imposes on both the image and on its maker. In what remains of this presentation, I will outline the status of Savonnerie workers and compare their regimentation to that of royal trees. The size of the Savonnerie carpets is a function not only of the trunks from which they hung, but also of the number of hands that made them. Larger looms could accommodate multiple weavers simultaneously, a setup that afforded accelerated production. As Duhamel du Monceau observed in L'Art de faire du tapis, the size of the carpets and the maneuvers workers needed to make around the looms necessitated extremely vast workshops, a setup documented in these 18th century plans of the Savonnerie. And I've highlighted in blue the location of the looms on this floor. According to the contract Colbert drew up with the Lourdes family in 1664, the General Hospital was called upon to supply at least 60 children to the manufactories at any given time. And as you can imagine, I don't have as many images to illustrate the remainder of this presentation. Rather, I will try to paint a picture of their working conditions through archival citation. Enlisted between the ages of 10 and 12, the children were submitted to a 3-month trial period before entering a 6-year apprenticeship. The demands posed by the Commission for the Grande Galerie were taxing, with conditions apparently so challenging that the manufacturers were constantly hemorrhaging workers. Pierre Dupont accused the Lourdes of being so barbarous toward their apprentices that they were sent away to perish at the Hôtel Dieu or were reduced to selling apples or picking pockets in the streets. Absences and escapes were both common and strictly monitored. A report from 1713 stated that between 1664 and 1673, 286 of the apprentices who had entered the program had died or run away. Contracts show that the General Hospital was responsible for paying for the children's food and medical care, and the Lourdes and Dupont were accountable for supplying a fresh set of attire each year as a child outgrew or wore out his or her clothing. Philippe Lourdes' 1617-4 inventory included 146, I quote, very small worn sheets of hemp serving as cots for the child workers of the manufactory, and 24 old small hemp shirts for the little child apprentices. This dismal description is striking, in part because the coarseness and loose weave of the canvas wares contrasts so starkly with the fineness of the Savonnerie carpets on which the orphans labored. The used state of the children's bedding and apparel also marks the thousands of days it took to weave the Savonnerie carpets. And the quotidian rhythms of eating, washing, and sleeping, the childhoods that slipped by therein. While the bucolic landscapes in the Savonnerie carpets mark no particular season or time of day, workers would have felt shifts in temperature and day length acutely as they worked from sunrise to sunset and then by candlelight. The regularity of knots at such a staggering scale is a mute testament then to an environment of toil by many people over a long period of time. Those overseeing the production of carpets had carefully calculated the relationship between time, volume, and monetary value. A carpet's value by volume was determined based on knot density, as denser carpets used more wool, and as weavers were paid by the number of knots they tied. The unit used to pay workers was the dizaine, this 10 knot by 10 knot square, of which I spoke earlier. Notebooks belonging to the de Vivier families who ran the Chaillot workshops in the 18th century contain multiplication tables to aid in the counting of knots and a ready reckoner to calculate the cost of a carpet based on the number of dizaines it contained. As a unit of labor time, the dizaine was highly variable in relation to volume, and this fact made it an object of contention. A dizaine could take up more space if knots were woven more loosely, or if 3-ply rather than 2-ply wool thread was used. Overseers also worried that by not adequately tamping down on the rows of knots with their specialized combs, workers not only undermined the tight structure of the carpet, they also inflated the appearance of how much work they had done. Surveillance and paternalism defined management's relationship to the carpet weavers, a stance that persisted through the 18th century. Workers were assessed in terms of their manual skill and efficiency, as a 1790 document reveals. The sheet lists biographical information, annual payment sums, and a description of the work quality of 21 weavers and 6 apprentices. It comments on their marital status, the health of their wives, the number of children they had, the distance they traveled to work, the quality of their eyesight, their speed, and their personalities. Henri Laurent Virton, for example, was a tranquil boy, a good worker, assiduous but slow. Jean-Baptiste Caillot, aged 26, had difficulty working due to his poor eyesight, which made his knots, they said, muddled. The Savonnerie overseers slotted the messy details of the workers' personal lives into a tabular display and made their character sketches a matter of administrative record. At every level of production then, Savonnerie entrepreneurs marshaled the grid as a framework through which they could cultivate uniformity and assert authority. Buried in the records and hidden in the colored warp threads beneath the fuzz of shorn knots, the unit of the dizaine encapsulates the intersection of volume with labor and matter. The dizaine looks like an objective grid, but it is rooted in handwork. It emerges from human effort, and its presence should remind us that size is never anodyne. In this case, the carpet's growth was predicated on depletion elsewhere, on trees felled and workdays transpired. The grid with which all parties were actually concerned was not, of course, an abstract idea. It was a real physical grid of wool and linen filled with knots tied by human hands. The thousands of meters woven, recorded as red chalk grids in the notebooks of entrepreneurs, relied on the management of relatively minuscule constituent elements, knots. Throughout the manufacturing process, it was necessary to control for size and variability, from the shape and height of trees and royal forests to the working habits of apprentices. In this way, the great extent Colbert sought for the Grand Galerie carpets materialized the state's forestry oversight and its command of a regimented workforce on a large scale. The carpet's volume is not only a testament to the management and acquisition of large trees or tons of wool, it is also a reification of human labor, of units of effort amassed and rendered anonymous. A comparison of how people and trees were employed in the manufacture of these carpets reveals some meaningful similarities and inversions. Apprentices were lauded for executing even, regular work. Their remuneration was greater the tighter and tinier their knots and the less visible their labor. When it came to knots, smaller units were preferable. Conversely, tall, straight trees allowed for larger carpets to be woven, affording a more seamless effect. Both figures, children and trees, helped furnish the illusion of uninterrupted grandeur. The weaver's small knots and the loom's large frame were scalar maneuvers designed to override the particulate nature of the carpet's production, such that a worker or a tree's individual qualities were valued only insofar as they led to their own effacement and final project. The visual unity of the carpet's great extent was predicated on the weaver making himself very small and on the procurement of trees of the greatest height. The depersonalization of man and tree this entailed is captured in this strange sketch by Father Touchet, tucked away among his forestry management papers. In the center of the sheet, he has drawn the outline of a tree with the descriptive economy that reveals his primary interest, the specimen's dimensions. Notes on the drawing's verso explain that he is working out a device to more accurately measure the tree, a task made difficult by the relative shortness of man. The problem is alluded to by the person drawn at left, in the upper left, whose feet dangle in midair and whose arms are outstretched as if he were held hostage. His body is splayed for measure, as it would be in a treatise on human proportions. That his back is turned to us further emphasizes that his physical reach, not his observational skill, is what concerns Touchet. Like the tree, he is faceless and featureless, a figure whose value resides in his utility, and whose utility resides in his bodily extent. Such anonymous bodies are inscribed in the Savonnerie carpets, their metrics simultaneously recorded and abstracted to the point of unrecognizability in the vast matrix of the 93 carpets. In conclusion, as a coda, I would like to share two couplings of children's and trees that come after the period of the carpets woven for the Grand Galerie. One appears in the first book of Orthopedics, written in 1741 to illuminate, I quote, the art of preventing or correcting bodily deformities in children. Its author coined the neologism by combining the Greek orthos for correct or straight with the word for child, paidion. In one passage, illustrated with a plate shown here, the author compares the process of straightening a child's leg to that of correcting the crooked trunk of a young tree with the aid of a stake or splint. Both tree and child are manipulated to adhere to a desirable model, a straight and regular specimen, an ideal that runs counter to their natures. The second coupling is discursive, and it shows a much evolved and perhaps elevated status for both tree and child. The Victoria and Albert Museum possesses a true tree portrait, painted by John Constable. The trunk of the venerable veteran elm tree is imbued with a level of textural detail more habitually reserved for human portraits. Of Constable's fondness for trees, his biographer wrote, "I have seen him admire a fine tree with an ecstasy of delight, like that with which he would catch up a beautiful child in his arms." The standards to which children and trees are held at any given moment seems then a sort of aesthetic litmus test for the place of parts within larger wholes. May the parts bend their way into view, or must they stay straight in line? Savonnerie carpets are still woven by hand in Lodève and at the Gobelin Manufactory in Paris. Thanks to a summer grant from the Decorative Arts Trust several years back, I was able to visit these workshops as part of my dissertation research. A visit to the Alençon Lace Museum was also on my itinerary. One of the UNESCO certified lace makers employed there described the shape of each lace maker's loop as a sort of identifiable handwriting. It was her comment, in fact, that prompted me to begin thinking about tensions between regularity and individuality in the early modern workshop, a productive tension that has long pervaded the very logic of craft itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was amazing. I have such a new perspective and so many questions already, but before I jump in, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Cleland, who is going to be sharing a discussion with Sarah. Hi, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the Associate Curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Her primary responsibilities are in the area of post-medieval European tapestries within the Met's collection. She has been at the Met since 2004 and worked on a slew of very impressive exhibitions. Her most recent, I believe, was Relative Values, the Cost of Art in Northern Renaissance, which was on view from 2017 to 2021. Prior to her appointment at the Metropolitan, she studied at the Courtauld Institute of Art and received her MA and PhD as a British Academy Scholar, and we are thrilled to have her. Elizabeth, thank you so much, and I will let you both chat. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction, Carrie. Yes, so Sarah, what can I say? That was such an eye-opening lecture. It's fantastic. As in addition to what Carrie mentioned, I'm lucky enough now to also be responsible for all post-medieval European textiles at the Met, including the Savonnerie, of which we have over 30 pieces. And, you know, I mean, I think one tends to think of the Savonnerie field as this very well plowed area of research. People like Pierre Verlet, of course, Edith Standen, who was a curator here at the Met, Madeleine Jarry, and then more recently, Charissa Bramer-David, Jean Vité, and my own colleague here at the Met, Wolf Burkhardt. But I think what you have managed to do is just take us a little, you know, take a step back from that very impressive royal setting of the Grande Galerie to really come to grips with the production process, to take a step away and take us into the Chaillot workshop, where, you know, it's as if we can hear the noise and the scale and the resources being put to work here. So it's lifting the veil, certainly, from my eyes. Now, I am, of course, approaching this field very much from as a tapestry specialist, as we've heard. But I think one of the things that really strikes me is not so much the similarities between Gobelin and Savonnerie, but more the differences. I mean, yes, of course, there are parallels even if Lebrun didn't direct both the Savonnerie and the Gobelins, as for so long scholars tended to think he did. But, you know, by 1825, they're sharing their workspace together. They'd always worked in relative geographic proximity. I think you'd agree, Sarah. Same raw materials, same royal patrons, and often ending up in the same royal locations. But the differences, and you spoke at the beginning of your paper about how Henri IV first introduces the weavers into workshops in the Louvre. And certainly when he's bringing tapestry weavers into the Louvre workshops and also sponsoring those working at the Faubourg Saint-Marcel and the Faubourg Saint-Germain, you know, I think everyone gets the sense that he's sort of trying to muscle in on a very established field. You know, tapestry weaving has been going on in Europe for centuries, and we've got the great centers, Tournai, in Flanders, of course, Brussels and so forth, and then with the diaspora, James I and Mortlake and all this. So it's really Henri, and of course that's going to become under Louis XIV and Colbert, the Gobelin workshops, first emulating and then surpassing this very established commercial appealing industry. But I don't know, would you agree, Sarah, that on the contrary, when he's bringing in Pierre Dupont and setting him up in a workshop also in the Louvre, it's a completely different ballgame. There really is no precedent for having carpet weaving workshops. I mean, yes, we've got the smaller workshops in Spain, places like Andalusia, but carpets at this point are still about the imports coming in from Turkey and the Near East, and the Europeans sort of trying to replicate and match up with those. And in contrast, Henri IV, and then when we go into Louis XIV, it's just so audacious. It's so ambitious to think of making large carpets, soft carpets, deep pile carpets to walk on, you know, not to put on tables or just to have on your dais steps, but on these floors. And I think you capture that idea of the triumph of just achieving the size.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear you talk about sort of the longue durée of textile manufacturing in France, and certainly Henri IV played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Savonnerie. So I'm very happy that our audience got some insight into that. And really though, I mean, you're absolutely right that the Savonnerie sort of rival workshops were sort of plugging along, and then it was if you know, they were ignited with rocket fuel after Colbert's commission. And I really wish we knew, the records are silent on this, why it was that he didn't end up obtaining these carpets from the Cairo workshops via Near Eastern trade routes. I'm sure part of it was his desire to make textile production as exclusively domestic as possible in France, but my sort of unsubstantiated inclination is that there was something else afoot, that he wasn't able to get the carpets, or it was cost prohibitive, even more cost prohibitive than having the carpets produced in France. And Wolf Burkhardt, as you mentioned, has done the most work recently to try and establish sort of a genealogy or narrative for the design of the carpets, about which I did not speak because he's written about it so extensively elsewhere. And it is sort of presumed, I would not contest his assertion that Charles Lebrun was sort of the architect of the Savonnerie design, but I also think that, like everything in this project, one person couldn't pull it off, you know, and that even in the designs he generated, Charles Lebrun would have sort of orchestrated and overseen for these carpets. I think he was sort of borrowing not only from his own cache of drawings and motifs and ideas that he had in his workshop, some of which we can see today in the Louvre, but also I think he was thinking back to complex decorative projects he'd been working on for decades, because he was already sort of a mature artist by the time he came to work for Louis XIV.
I think absolutely, Sarah, you're quite right. Because I agree. I likewise like very much Wolf's hypothesis of how Lebrun, grapples with this and stamps some conformity, uniformity, and has these, the echoing designs and a little bit of an architectural element to make it all work coherently. But indeed, it feels now, having heard you speak, that really is the sort of the last element in the equation. Before then, when he's just thinking about Cairo, that's fascinating. I mean, there you've got the first audacious idea, just thinking of carpeting a space that large in and of itself is astonishing. But then you can sort of see the wheels turning as he thinks, well, okay, we're not going to make that work, but instead we're going to really turn this to advantage and show how France can achieve this scale of production, which was really eye-opening. And also, of course, in your paper, the deep dive into the relationship with the workhouses, the orphans. I mean, this is something, again, when one reads the literature and you see those references to bringing in orphans to train them and apprentice them in the field of carpet weaving. I mean, you really, as you said, Savonnerie, it's everything about it. It's so decadent and plush. It evokes this great richness, and yet there is this rather nasty underlay with the seamier side of Paris. And for me, I always thinking in those terms of employing the orphans, I thought of it more within the broader context in France at this date, sort of 1650s through to 1680s, of all these different new religious orders which are being set up with very much this sort of overtly philanthropic motive of trying to rescue orphans and impoverished children and give them a profession. I mean, the ones I've been more interested in always tend towards the female. So yeah, you've got things like the Madelonette, where the lay sisters were actually walking the streets of Paris to try and find young girls who were embarking on a life of prostitution and, showing them the error of their ways, bringing them back and teaching them handicrafts, or the Sisters de la Charité, where they're being taught to become school teachers. And of course, here at the Met, we've got these great large tapestry scale needlework hangings after Lebrun designs made at the Convent of Saint-Joseph de la Providence, where they are bringing in orphaned girls and teaching them needlework. Certainly, within the context of also having whole teams of professional male embroiderers who are doing the teaching and also directing the work, and then taking on these massive commissions for the likes of Madame de Montespan. So, my take was more perhaps that we could see it as a slightly more pragmatic idea of, because carpet weaving is not yet such a Eurocentric skill set, they're still depending elsewhere a lot on bringing in the imports or going down to the Spanish Peninsula. Maybe there was an element, of trying to get a local skill set, a local profession really up and running with that. But certainly, I mean, from your perspective, it seems much more just a cynical means of getting some cheap labor.
Yes, I mean, I'm certainly, one must always remind oneself of one's modern, now 21st century, perhaps Marxist inflected perspective. And actually, in the case of the Savonnerie carpets, the idea to employ children dates back to Marie de Médicis, who wanted to save them from listlessness, from like fainéance. There's a little sort of scrap of paper that is not easy to date, but that sort of evokes that in the Savonnerie archives. So in many ways, the sort of the intentions behind the employment conscription of these orphans has much in common with that you allude to in the field of needlework. I mean, that's such a great and important comparison. I don't know, and yet I just read about the conditions and also these descriptions, which again date to the 18th century, but I'm kind of sort of borrowing them for perspective. it's hard not to feel troubled, you know. It's hard, and I think it's worthwhile to both sort of to at once sort of maintain that sort of historian's critical distance, but also to let one's empathy be sort of stirred in thinking about these objects, because when I look at decorative arts, I'm always thinking about the maker and the conditions of production as something that could potentially, through sort of new methods and new research, maybe even change how we interpret those objects and how they're working and how they're functioning.
Definitely, I'd say, you know, after hearing these details you've gleaned from the archives, when I go down to our Reitzman period rooms and see we have a couple of, well, there are 3 Grand Galerie carpets in the Met's collection. 2 of them are out on display. When I see those, when I look at them now, having heard those heart-wrenching details, the blankets, the little shirts, it certainly puts a whole new lens onto them. And again, I think that's another thing where we've got such a difference with what's going on in the tapestry weaving context, because, you know, firstly, there's more local talent. So it's not this idea of where on earth are we going to get a workforce to create these things at this pace. So I think it seems to be a much less punishing context.
And this is not to denigrate the skills of Savonnerie carpet weavers, but there is a bit more of perhaps a paint by numbers logic to Savonnerie carpets, given that you're working in this really, honestly, very rigid grid format, point by point. And when I visited Lodève in the south of France, I saw some sort of surviving worksheets from the 60s, in which really you have basically sort of graph paper color coded. And at that time, France was continuing its sort of questionable sourcing of a workforce. They resettled a large community of Algerians to Lodève in the 60s, which I'm sure you know. And so many women, Algerian women, it was recommended to them that they learn how to weave in this now state run and very prestigious workshop, and they were of course compensated, but it's very grueling labor.
Hard work.
Definitely. Hard work. Yeah.
Actually, I'm interested with you mentioning that in the 20th century example, it's women, and as I've mentioned, you know, thinking of the sort of the broader context in France, again, it's often orphaned girls. Did you get a sense when looking through the document, all these lists of names and character traits? Is it both boys and girls, or? Well,
it's difficult to. I can't say that I can confirm the genders of the children. They're sort of referred to en masse. Later documents, when they refer to weavers who are more, sort of further along in their careers, they're all men. But I can also imagine that you know, really young children are surely doing all sorts of tasks that are not tying knots, right? I'm sure they're fetching things and sharpening things and folding things, and I don't know. They're doing probably many other things, but it's not. So I would say that it's probably gendered more masculine, whereas, as you said, needlework is gendered in a more feminine way. Although Duhamel du Monceau, in his 1766 treatise, talks about how carpet weaving, the only way to make it financially soluble was to employ children and women, as one could pay them less. So in 1766, there was perhaps by then a more concerted shift to having women and children in the Savonnerie workshops.
And one last thing, because I realized I actually heard our departmental grandfather clock chime there, the hour. One last thing I wanted to also just touch base with you on is that another, you know, sort of accepted factoid repeated in the Savonnerie literatures in that 1664 agreement, that a painter from the Académie Royale is going to come regularly to teach some of the children design. Are you going to destroy my illusions there too?
No. I think, gosh, that fact has always fascinated me. And were archival records more generous, perhaps we would learn of an orphan who then went on to, the Académie de Saint-Luc in Paris and was a genre painter or something like that. I don't know, but in this, you're referring to the Jean Vité article, I think, and in the posthumous inventory of the Chaillot workshops, of the director's posthumous inventory detailing the contents of his workshops, there is a reference to drawing paper. Mm-hmm. So I do imagine that drawing was taught, and perhaps I imagine that the more skilled and well-behaved children were perhaps given the luxury of drawing in the hopes that they would advance in the workshops. Yeah, that's my theory. And I don't know, Carrie, should we look at the Q&A now?
I mean, I'm sorry, I was just so fascinated by that. I wish there were more archival records, but I'm sure you did every possible form of digging that one could. We have two sort of questions, both relating to the material of the carpets. One, what was the warp material made from?
Linen threads. Right.
Is there a particular reason that linen was used, or?
I think for its strength. That Lizzie, I'm sure you could speak to this better than I could.
Yeah, it's interesting because certainly in Northern Europe, especially France, at this date, the warp's always going to be wool. But I think the great advantage of linen for in a tapestry, but linen for the carpets is that they could be warped up on the loom damp. And then as they would dry, they would be really stiff and really strong and really taut and tense, because of course that was one of the great challenges, to be able to keep the tension of the warp and the great weights which were needed to just warp certain sections of carpets as they were weaving.
Yeah, and then every between a row of knots, a weft thread is sent through, and every 10 of those was of a blue or brown color, as a way to count the number of rows that a weaver had finished. And there was another question, Carrie?
Where did the wool come from?
Yes, I wish I could answer this question, and you're not the first person to ask it of me. It's a bit of a mystery. So I believe that while the linen thread came from Flanders, the wool, especially, we don't know if the wool was dyed at Chaillot, or if it came from merchants in Paris who specialized in dyeing wool, or if they sort of shared sources, resources, and techniques with the Gobelins. It seems like it could have been a mix, given the information that we have. But Lizzie, maybe you've come across something with greater clarity.
No, I would just, that's very interesting hearing you say that, Sarah. Sort of the traditional accepted thinking was one of the differences between Gobelin and Savonnerie, is that they use different dye works. Right. Is one of those head scratches. But yes, certainly, I mean, when you're thinking of the other context, Flanders tapestries and so forth, they're using English wool, but the French, for obvious reasons, are not going to be wanting to use English wool, no matter how good it was. So I wonder if I think it's possible that it was a mixture of on-site
dyed wool because there are these sort of dyeing tubs again that we see in these after death inventories, but then there are also references to getting wool from unnamed merchants in Paris. If we had their names, I'm sure we could dig further, but we don't have their names. But yeah, of course, this dyed wool was incredibly valuable, and as Lizzie and many of you know, it was quite important to have a large supply of wool that had been dyed at the same time in a given color, so that at the very least within a single carpet you had harmony, unity, continuity of black, for example. And black being, I think, one of the most sensitive colors
yeah,
that the Savonnerie used. Yeah.
Black is and had been from the 15th century already one of the most expensive, most prized yarns to achieve that really deep lustrous black. Yeah. But it's used using an iron mordant, which as it oxidizes and is exposed to oxygen over time, it becomes corrosive, which sometimes causes the yarns dyed with that to disintegrate, which can be a major problem in all the textile fields. Yeah. And yet so many of the Grande Galerie tapestry, carpets, and also some of the earlier Savonnerie carpets have this dark blue, black or brown ground. Some of them have fared horribly, and so you get a lot of restoration just to make up for those patches where it's just one, but other ones haven't. They've retained that lustrousness. So indeed, it's, you know, the secret of the dye recipe that the dyers who made those black yarns knew how to avoid this horrible deterioration, which others didn't. So absolutely. And
I think that and this is something that I did not mention in my talk, but perhaps another reason why, I mean, of course, as I mentioned, some of the carpets have fared horribly, but some of them are just in kind of impeccable condition. And part of that is because they were never, we have no record of their being displayed together. That is one of the greatest ironies of this whole project is, and I've discussed this with various sort of art historians of the period, and you're thinking, why would you not unroll them as many times as possible? So much work went into them. And one thought that I think Dina Goodman shared with me was, well, he didn't care about the Louvre by the time they were finished. It took too long. He was at Versailles and he didn't want anything to do with the Louvre after the 20 years it took to weave them.
Absolutely.
So after they were finished, they they had to get more trees to roll them up in the garde-meuble and store them. Yeah. So.
And they are really heavy. Now that I can attest to. We recently deinstalled some of ours to give them a good surface clean, and then reinstalled. My colleagues in our textile conservation department are superstars. But you know, again, coming to the field very much as a tapestry person, I thought tapestries were heavy, but they are light compared to a Savonnerie carpet of the same scale. So just the handling of these things will have been such a challenge that I suppose they will have thought twice. And indeed, even now in the museum context, I mean, you mentioned the depressing case of Getty. And as I said here at the Met, we have, you know, over 30 Savonnerie pieces of varying sizes and scales. And yet only a handful are out on display because the carpets are so big.
Yeah,
you just don't have the space to show them, unfortunately.
Yeah, they're just exceptionally large. And I just saw one question. I'm sure we should conclude today. I saw one question in the Q&A from Lynn. She asks if changes in technology affected the way they thought about producing the rugs. And I think by that you mean how the rugs are produced today in France by the Mobilier National. And I'm sure there are many subtle differences in how they're made, in terms of, I'm sure that the dye technology is much refined, and the hours of the workers are more respectable. But something that will never cease to amaze me about French artisanal culture is the sort of the deep genealogy and endurance through time of these handwork traditions. And so there are really I think there's more in common in the 2021 production of Savonnerie carpets than has changed in the production of Savonnerie carpets. Much has stayed the same in how they're made today.
And you can visit their workshops.
You can. In the easy workshop to visit is at the Gobelin website in Paris. And if you really want a pilgrimage, you can go to the south of France and near Montpellier. You can take a bus or a car to go to Lodève, but that's quite a trek.
No, I think it sounds incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. I want to give you each a chance, if you're willing to share something you're currently working on that you're excited about. If it's a research project or an exhibition, maybe Liz, if you have anything to share, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say my colleagues here at the Met and I are all just thrilled that we're back in the building. And certainly a lot of the work right now is the sort of nuts and bolts of thinking about the permanent collection in the galleries. I just mentioned we've just done this vacuuming campaign of our Savonnerie carpets. And in the longer term, I'm co-curating an exhibition with my paintings colleague Adamika on art at the Tudor courts. So, 100 years earlier than the Savonnerie, but also thinking on an audacious scale.
Amazing. Something to look forward to.
Yeah, I will definitely look forward to that exhibition, in part because I'm someone who sort of works thematically and likes to work in print and drawing and painting and carpets and gardens and across materials and mediums. So, well, I mean, really what I'm most focused on now that especially since I defended my dissertation, what was it, a month and a half ago, is really diving into this amazing exhibition that we're putting together at the Clark. Yes, this exhibition will feature 18th century French drawings from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. We're going to produce a really beautiful catalog, and that will open in December 2022. So getting that ready is taking up most of my time, along with thinking about what the next big research projects will be. I can say this very, very early stage that I'm thinking about French women in scientific illustration in the 18th century. That's perhaps the next horizon for me.
Sounds fascinating and sounds incredible. I'm so happy for both of you that you keep producing this incredible work. I forgot to mention in my introduction that Sarah also received a research grant from the Trust, and we are honored to sponsor incredible scholars like her. So thank you both for your time and all of your work. I am thrilled to continue watching what you do. And thank you to all of our participants. Again, this program is recorded, so if you missed anything or you want to rewatch it, just wait till next week. You will receive a link in your inbox, I promise. So thank you both, and thank everyone and thank you to everyone who's watching. I hope everyone has a lovely Thursday afternoon, and I'll see you next time you attend a Trust program. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.